Why one size fits all training fails. Most coaches train their own neurotype. So I've fallen into this as well. I'm naturally a sprinter type. So when I was coaching swimmers, what I would naturally do before I found neurotyping, what I would naturally do is I would train them in a way that I understood as a coach, as an athlete as well. So I would train them more for the sprinty type events, and training would be more, I'm a 1B, my training would be more suited to the 1B type swimmers. You have other coaches who are more, would have done better on like an endurance program, and that's why they train their club and their team based on very endurance type methods, because it's what they understand based on their own neurotype. The problem is that's going to work for some athletes quite well, but it's not going to work for most of the athletes. There's probably going to be 90% of the athletes that are not going to do very well on that program because there are 5 different neurotypes. And unless you happen to be the same neurotype as the coach, and if the coach knows what they're doing, then chances are the program's not going to be optimized for you. It's not going to be taking your personal, physical, and motivational personality needs into account. So the same program can get very different results. And that's kind of what we're fixing with neurotyping. So what is neurotyping? Basically, it's an understanding of your brain chemistry and your personality. I found this from Christian Thibodeau. This is based on other personality methods and understandings from other fields. And Christian Thibodeau kind of brought it into the training world and kind of split it up into more zones that make it helpful for us to understand things from a training perspective. So the 5 dominant types are 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and 3. And basically what we're doing from these is we're understanding different types. Each of these different types are going to have different sensitivities and different like amounts of different neurotransmitters. So for examples, we have the excitatory neurotransmitters. If someone is very dopamine sensitive, they're going to respond very differently to training as opposed to someone who's very adrenaline sensitive. Someone who's very adrenaline dominant, that's the main neurotransmitter that helps them get into an excitatory state, can increase their arousal levels, usually are going to need longer warm-ups. They're usually going to get better towards the end of practice. They're usually not going to be able to tolerate as intense work, but they can usually do things a bit longer. They can handle lactate better, things like that. Whereas people that are, their main excitatory neurotransmitter is dopamine, they're going to be your more sprinter types, people that love intensity. They're going to be the thrill seeker types. They're going to be the people with very addictive personalities. They're going to be very high and then low, able to go up and then calm back down again. Then you have like your inhibitory neurotransmitters, things like serotonin and GABA. Serotonin is going to be more balanced, like a 1B is going to be able to control their balance a bit more, whereas GABA is a bit more on or off. And then you've got things like acetylcholine, which is going to change how people learn things, how fast people are able to learn things. And if you have enough acetylcholine, it can mask other things to make your training process different. People with higher acetylcholine, for example, are going to crave more variety. They're going to want to crave changes in their program a bit more. And then you have glutamate, which is basically increases your emotions. It makes you more emotional. So people with higher glutamate levels are going to feel things more intensely. They're going to be motivated by different things. Things like the 2B, for example, usually have much higher glutamate levels, which is why they are seen as the emotional or the sensation neurotype, which means, again, all of these different things, like we don't need to go into all of this, but just giving you an idea for the different ratios and the different sensitivities to neurotransmitters in your brain can affect your personality. And those influences on your personality give us an idea of how you're going to best respond to training and what training you're going to be most motivated by, what kinds of training you're going to be able to recover better from. So what does all this stuff tell me as a coach? It's going to tell me how much volume can you tolerate. For example, the more sprinter type, then we'll go into all the types, but the more sprinter types are going to need lower volume and more intensity because that's what they crave. And that higher intensity work, they're going to be able to recover from that much easier. Recovery needs, again, also volume tolerance. The people like the type 3s, people with higher anxiety, because they can't hit that intensity to get their training in that they need, they're going to need higher volumes, but they're also going to want higher volumes. They're going to want to crave higher volumes. Like a type 3, for example, really is going to enjoy longer distance events because it's more predictable, because they're able to plan their training more. There's going to be less surprises, there's less intensity. It's basically something that's going to reduce their anxiety overall. So different volume tolerances per different neurotype. Better recovery from different types of work. It's kind of what we've said there. Some people are going to be able to recover, do a really intense workout, and then feel fresh the next day. Whereas that same person might do kind of a grindy workout and it might take them a week to recover. Whereas another neurotype, like a type 2B, might do really well with kind of a grindy workout where, you're feeling the burn, you're getting a bit more lactate kind of stuff in your muscles. They're going to feel fresh the next day, or a couple of days later, they're going to be ready to do that kind of work again. But those 2Bs, if they do an intense workout, as in sprints or very heavy lifting, things like that, if they do a lot of that, then that's going to take them a week to recover from that. So there's different types of work that different neurotypes are going to recover from more easily. Then there's motivation, like your type 1s, your more dopamine dominant types, your sprinter types are going to be more motivated by winning the workout. They're not going to care as much about what people think of them. They're going to be more motivated by winning. Whereas, your 2As and your 2Bs are going to be more motivated by what people think of them, earning respect, being liked, being admired by other people. And then you have your type 3s who are more motivated by being in control, and they enjoy the technical side of things. They enjoy planning and seeing those gradual results over time. And then session length and intensity, we kind of hit on that, where certain types are going to want very intense sessions, but very short sessions. Other neurotypes are going to want a mix of all of those things, of a bit of muscular work, a bit of neural high intensity work. And then some neurotypes are going to need longer sessions because they're going to want to do more sets. They're going to need more warm-up sets, things like that. Again, none of that's super important. It's just to give you an idea of what neurotyping is and why it's useful. Oh my God. Okay, so neurotyping. It's not about finding the perfect program because everything's going to work to an extent, but it's about finding the right program for you, right? There's stuff that is going to really work much better for you, and there's stuff that's just going to leave you drained and depleted and feeling tired and feeling like you're catching up on recovery all the time. So my first experience with neurotyping was when I was coaching kids, and I started learning about neurotyping and started talking to the kids about neurotyping and helping them understand, what do you think of this? Is this, because I knew the kids pretty well, I would say that you're this kind of neurotype. I would say you're this kind of neurotype. And that would indicate that you're going to do better off this kind of training. And they were like, oh, that makes so much sense. So they went away and did their own neurotype tests. And then I basically started training them for their neurotype and not for their event anymore. So we went from doing sprint sessions and more mid-distance style sessions. We were basically training the kids for their event. When we switched to training them for their neurotype, they started making much quicker gains. They started enjoying practices much more, and they started getting faster. We had kids that were not sprinter types, but they wanted to do the sprints. So we did them more higher volume work, more technical focus on that sprint work, but not too much high intensity work, and they got faster at the sprints. Whereas we had other people that were sprinter types that wanted to go up and do like 200s and stuff, but we kept the majority of their program very sprinty and just had a little sprinkle of extra longer distance stuff here, and they started doing really well. So my biggest takeaway from that is that it is much more important to train you for your neurotype and then train for your event that you're trying to swim as a side effect, as like a afterthought, as not an afterthought, but like neurotype should be the foundation, because that's you, right? It's how you're going to respond to training. And then your event, whatever events you want to do or whatever you want to be able to do in life, is going to be, okay, how do we fit that? How do we fit training for that into your neurotype? Hope that makes sense. So neurotype training is more important than training for your event. Just some examples. When I worked with Chad Leclos, Olympic champion, he'd had a hard run for a few years. He'd gone from the worst season of his career the year previously to, we'll talk about it, but he'd basically not done much proper or structured strength training because he had a bad experience in the past with a strength coach. But here's the interesting thing. That strength coach that he was working with basically had really good success with some other very successful sprinters that were more sprinter types. And the program was designed for the 1A, 1B types. But Chad was a 2A. He was a 100, 200 butterflyer, but more 200 butterflyer coming down to the 100. But he was a 2A, which means he is not going to thrive with a lot of very high intensity work, which is what that program was. And what ended up happening is he ended up putting on 10 kilos of muscle in that season. And I think he put on like 5 seconds in his 200 fly or something. Like he couldn't swim properly because he was so heavy and he was so drained by the type of work that they were doing in the gym. I'm sure there are other factors as well, but that's just a correlation. So we made sure that when I was making his program, I didn't want to take anything away from the pool because he's a very good swimmer and he had a very good coach at the time in the pool. So we wanted to do the least damage possible, made him take a neurotype test. He's a 2A, which means he craves variety, not a lot of intensity work, but a bit of high intensity work and a fairly even mix between that and more muscular work. So we had a big mix of a little bit of power work, a little bit of heavy strength work, a little bit of more muscular work, more longer like isometric holds and things like that are longer duration and more muscular in nature. And we were allowed, because of that mix and because we were keeping things varied, we were able to keep his focus on the basics and do the basics while still keeping him engaged, because things felt like they were fresh all the time, but we were still basically giving him the same stuff over and over again. But it was mentally stimulating for him because his interpretation of what we were doing, it felt like things were switching up all the time, which is what the 2A needs. But basically what happened after that season, because he was able to stick with the program for a long time, he was enjoying it. It was keeping him fresh for his swim practices, which is the most important part. He went from the worst season of his career to double gold at World Championships, even won a lifetime best over 30 years old, and everyone told him he was washed out and he'd, never win a medal again. Lifetime best. Pretty inspirational, pretty crazy story. And a part of that was because he had started training in terms of his neurotype and not just going willy-nilly and just working really hard and grinding against things. Before we go into all the types one by one, I'm just going to briefly kind of outline all the different types. Because this is a very long video, I want you to kind of, once you read through the types, go to the one or two that you think might be more beneficial to you. You can go through all of them, but it is a very long video otherwise. But you can skip to the parts that are going to be more specific to what you think you're going to be. But before we get into that, I'm not going to put this at the end. There's a reminder at the bottom of the video, but don't forget to do the assignment. As you go through this, I want you to understand what your biggest takeaway is. Comment that below, your biggest takeaway and your biggest challenge or concern with this. Comment below. That's it. Then you move on to the next video, which is the game plan video. The game plan video kind of puts all of this together. Cool. So let's go through the types. Okay, so very quickly, before we go into all the types, I'm just going to read through all of the traits for each type. I think it would be beneficial for you to go through all of the types so you can understand the differences and, maybe get a better understanding for what you might be or what parts of different neurotypes you might be. But I'm going to go through all of them so that if you want to, you can skip to the one or two that you're like, okay, that one might be me. And then you can you can skip that because this video is going to be very long otherwise. So go through it if you want to, but here are all the types and all of the traits. If one or two of these pop out to you most, skip to that section and watch that part. So here we go. Type 1A is the intensity neurotype. So I'm just going to read through all of these. Type 1As are very verbal, talk a lot, talk loud. They like to intimidate the other person if they don't have great argumentative skills. They always want to be the leader or the center of attention. They don't do well with authority. They will argue with authority. They have very high self-esteem and high confidence, partly why they don't outwardly care about what others think of them. Can be happy to piss people off. Very competitive, trash talker, sore losers and sore winners. When they lose, they'll act in a way to reduce the worth of the other person's victory. They're very intense, but they burn out easily. They struggle to pace themselves in training or work. They hate rules unless they're breaking them. They want to do things their own way. They love to convince others they're right. They're impatient. They're very goal-driven. They seek conflict a lot of the time so that they can win the situation. They act on impulse and emotions, decisions not thought through fully, not fully developed or strategized. They're great under pressure. They are, same with the 1Bs, they do their best when the stakes are the highest. And they struggle to get their arousal level up if the stakes aren't high. They love to take risks, daredevil sports, gambling, drugs, drinking, general thrill-seeking behaviors. They will go and try and do those things if they're not getting enough dopamine type stuff from their training. They can be very charismatic, but after a while it becomes obvious that everything is about them. They're good at getting things done when they need to, and they can be great motivators for a short period of time at least, because it's all about them and them motivating people in their own way, which often can work very well for other type 1As or other athletes for short periods of time. But again, the biggest thing with them is the burnout. Then we go to type 1Bs. I'm a 1B. Type 1B, the one word to describe them is explosive. They can have an explosive personality and have lots of energy, but then 2 minutes later, they're very calm. So most of the time they tend to be very calm, but can have bursts of explosiveness. They seek out more intense thrill-seeking activities, sports, gambling, similar to the 1A. They're constantly needing to try new experiences and they crave getting new knowledge. They like reading nonfiction books and taking courses and things like that. High self-esteem, they won't go out of their way to seek approval from others necessarily, but they're more aware of others than the type 1A. 1Bs can be very interested in what other people think about them, but if that is seen as a competition to win, if it's a competition to win the approval of others, but otherwise they won't care as much, but they are more balanced than the 1A, so they tend to be more likable than the 1As. They're very competitive, but not quite as extreme as the 1A, more likely to play it cool when losing or winning. Very easy motor learning. They pick things up very quickly. They're fast learners, can be annoying for others because they learn things so fast. They're fast, agile, explosive, better at using the stretch reflex, so like bouncing in and out of movements, than being particularly strong. So they're generally not as strong as the 1As, but they can use the stretch reflex to their advantage in speed exercises. So bouncing in and out of lifts is good for them. They're good at focusing on one thing, but also good at switching between tasks quickly. This is often seen as ability to multitask, when really it's just they're able to switch between tasks quite quickly. They're impatient. They prefer to be doing something in the meantime while waiting. They hate waiting and like to be growing and improving and moving forwards constantly. So rather than waiting in line somewhere, they would rather walk around take the long way round, so they're doing something in the meantime. Very goal-driven, not greatly affected by what others think of them, as much as the other neurotypes that are later on, but still able to take feedback into consideration. Very good under pressure. They find it difficult to swim fast in season, but when the stakes are high, they thrive. They love to take risks and go all in on something that is completely new, completely different. Doesn't do well with authority, but they tend to take a less direct approach than the 1A to tackle that. So that's the 1Bs. If that sounds like you, skip to the 1B part. Type 2A, they're the chameleons. The one word to describe the 2As is variety. So everything works, but nothing works for a very long time. They're highly motivated by earning respect and admiration of others. They tend to mimic the behavior of the person in front of them or do whatever is needed to be liked or appreciated by the person they're with. They tend to be people pleasers. Naturally, like it's not like if you worked on it, that might not be you. You might think, oh, I'm not a people pleaser, but it's something that you naturally have been or naturally would be. Don't like going into large groups if they don't know many of them or any of them. They hate to feel left out. Their lower self-esteem, they have lower self-esteem when they're at rest or when their adrenaline level is low, but their self-esteem increases as their adrenaline level gets higher. So in social situations, when they're around loads of people, as they get more amped up, they're likely to feel like they have higher self-esteem. Doesn't take much adrenaline to boost them into that high self-esteem, but they can easily choke if there's too much pressure on them. They want to get along with everybody, great at creating different personalities based on the situation. It's hard to get the truth out of them sometimes. They'll be very excited to make plans with you face to face, but then they'll cancel their plans later over text or something because they don't want to hurt your feelings. They need to be liked. Great at reading people, so they know how to respond in an appropriate way. They need to create reciprocity with the person they're talking to. When someone's talking, they'll say, no way, same thing happened to me, and find common ground very quickly. Want others to think highly of them. A little appreciation goes a very long way. They really appreciate a little bit of appreciation. Losing face is very destructive for them. Making fun of them, even as a joke, can hurt their feelings, reduce their self-esteem. Tend to mimic the most influential person around them, or tend to pick up accents very easily from people that they're around. Imitating professional athletes can be a great way to motivate them and get them to understand techniques or mindsets. Doesn't like to make decisions mainly because they don't want to upset people, because they want to be liked. They need variation and change a lot. They procrastinate and do their best work at the last minute. So that's the type 2As. If that sounds like you, skip to the 2A part. 2Bs, generally lower self-esteem, great at reading people, more introverted, but still need the respect and approval of others. They can become more extroverted when they feel good and their adrenaline increases, similar to the 2As, but they're better one-on-one. The 2As tend to be the party people, the friends with everyone. 2Bs tend to have fewer but very close relationships. They can make you feel very important. They're very emotional. They can easily fall in love. They love to dress well and look good. They like displays of emotion and grand gestures. They give everything to their close relationships. They're often seen as the good guy because they're very much people pleasers, although they can be seen as weak because of this as well. They want to avoid disappointing people at all costs. Their greatest need is to be liked, desired, admired. They're great at listening to others and helping other people. They don't like to be the main leader role because they don't want to disappoint people. They'll work harder than everyone else if they think it'll earn them respect. They will sacrifice their well-being for the good of others. They're the most prone to choking under pressure. They don't want a whole lot of variation in their program. They tend to like to stick to the exercises that they love. 2Bs, if that sounds like you at all, skip to the 2B section where we go more into detail on that. And then finally, the final bit is the type 3s. If this sounds like you, skip to the type 3 bit. Usually introverted unless they feel in control of the situation or have a lot of experience. So the one word to describe the type 3s is control, because they have the highest anxiety. So a lot of their personality is built around managing that anxiety, making things more predictable. They can be uncomfortable when they're too relaxed because they let their guard down. So they often have like a little bit of a wall up. They can struggle to adapt due to high levels of cortisol naturally. So recovery is really important for the type 3s because of that high anxiety, their recovery capacity is much lower. They function better when they're following a structure or routine because it makes things predictable. They don't deal well with unexpected changes in a plan. They're very objective, and less intuitive. So they go more by logical thinking and research that they've done rather than what feels right necessarily. They hate taking risks, love playing it safe, prefer repetition over novelty or variation. They're a great observer and an information gatherer. They intellectualize their decisions. They don't tend to talk a lot unless enough data is gathered to have an opinion. They can be secretive about sharing information with others because sharing information might make them more vulnerable, things like that. Not thrill seekers, less inclined to create social connections because of their introvertedness. Extreme focus and concentration. They're very patient. They need to feel in control to push hard enough to progress. And they have the lowest capacity to recover from high intensity work, but they tend to be more drawn to longer distance events because it's more predictable, because it's longer, and they can actually handle much higher volumes of training, but not of high intensity work because it increases their cortisol, whereas longer, slower training can actually reduce their cortisol, make them feel much better because it helps them feel in control. So as I've gone through those types, pick the ones that you can watch all of these videos. There's going to be really interesting for all to go through all of this stuff. But if you want to save some time, you can go straight to the ones that sound most like you and then go through those. And then make sure that you go to watch the end of this video as well so that you know what the assignment is and you can know, because there's the last video and then you get to, no, the next video is the last video and then you unlock your reward. So make sure you do those assignments so that you can get that in time. So 1A neurotype, this is the intensity neurotype. So the 1As are wired for intensity, competition, challenge, dopamine. So common traits are they're very assertive, they're very loud, they like to dominate social situations, so they often want to be the leaders of a group. They thrive on pressure. These are the people that are, because they love competition, they're often going to very much step up when the stakes are high, right? So they want to increase their arousal as much as possible to get them into a good arousal state to perform at their highest. Mainstream programs are going to fail for the 1As because there's too much volume. The 1As, because they crave that intensity, they want to do very intense work, but they can't maintain that for a very long time. So high volume programs are not going to work. Also, programs that work too much on the muscles, so like bodybuilding programs, are very much, not going to work for the 1As. They're going to feel very drained. They're going to be very sore if you're focusing just on like muscular work and muscular burn and things like that, muscular fatigue or high volume things, repetitive circuits. That's just going to drain them, right? Because it's not neurologically stimulating. So this is going to lead them, yes, they're going to burn out very easily on programs that have even moderate volume probably. They're going to feel depleted. They're going to get injured quickly on programs like that. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to end up quitting or just grinding themselves into the ground where they're mentally feeling terrible all the time. They're not going to be sleeping very well. These are, if you ever worked in a school or you have kids or something, these are the kids that are very loud, but then, once they're drained, they're very hard to deal with, because, and they have such low energy because they get burned out very easily, very quickly. And it's not healthy for them. So a lot of 1A people can also, have like ADHD kind of symptoms and things like that because they're misunderstood, because they are wanting that intensity. So they have this like single focus on this one area and they really lock in, but then they can overdo it and they can lock in for too hard for too long, or they can just be put in situations that don't suit that kind of intensity. So they get burned out because they get bored, right? They are people that will very easily get bored, and because of their high sensitivity to dopamine, they can do, if they're not stimulated in a healthy way by training or, mentally being stimulated, then they will often look for ways to increase their dopamine in unhealthy ways. So things like gaming or drinking or, like very thrill-seeking kind of activities where you're being very stimulated. But again, doing any of that stuff can burn them out. So it's kind of short periods of that high intensity stuff is what they need. And that's going to help balance them out. So strength over sweat, power over punishment, intensity without excess volume. So what they're going to crave. So if you're a 1A, what's going to work best for you is short workouts, lifting heavy or working towards lifting heavy for short periods of time. Usually we keep things under 10 seconds. So we keep the reps low. So 5 reps or less usually for our 1A neurotypes. And we have a little bit of explosive work in there, but the 1As are going to want to lift heavy rather than do very explosive things. More the bouncy explosive work is going to be more the 1B neurotypes. So 1As are going to want to do heavy stuff, right? And they're going to want to win the workout. So that means they're going to be highly motivated by lifting heavier each week and seeing that win, seeing, okay, whoa, I lifted heavier than I ever have before. Boom, that's a win. Yes, they're going to get pumped up by that. Chasing numbers, hitting PBs, that's going to be good for them. What's going to kill them is very slow tempos. So not necessarily things like if you're lifting a heavy weight, doing the eccentric portion, the lowering portion for like 3 to 5 seconds and then pushing back up. If you're keeping that weight heavy and those reps low, as a 1A, you're still going to be stimulated by that. But what I'm talking about is if you're doing sets that are lasting like 30 seconds or longer. So if you're doing slow tempos and that set is lasting over 30 seconds. So if you're doing like, 3 seconds down and then pushing up, and if you're doing like a set of 15 reps for that, a 1A is going to hate that. It's going to be terrible for them. Long repetitive sets. So doing more than 5 sets of an exercise is going to leave a 1A just super bored. The only time that we go up to 5 sets with a 1A is if we are ramping them up, like they're building up to a PB set, because that's motivating for them, because they can feel that dopamine's rising in their brain. When they get to that final set, they're like, boom, okay, great, and then they're done. And then too much muscular work, like grinding, doing bicep curls to feel the burn, all that kind of stuff, they're not going to care about that. They don't care about the sensation. They don't care so much about looking amazing or anything like that. They care about winning the workout. They care about being stimulated with high intensity work. So what's going to work for them is high intensity, very low volume. So with 1As, we usually never go more than 4 exercises for a workout, and we will focus on one of them in that session. So they'll have like one exercise that we focus on like more than the others. And then the other 2 exercises will still be highly intense, but we'll do a lower volume of those. Big compound lifts. So, your basics, your squats, pull-ups, variations of bench pressing and overhead pressing and hip hinging exercises. Not doing things like 1As aren't going to respond super well to doing like unilateral work for like higher reps. So, instead of doing like overarm presses with one side, they would rather, because it's a more intense stimulus into their nervous system, they'd rather go 2. Okay. It's less coordination as well, because it allows them to give more intensity, because it's a simpler exercise, but it's more stress on the system at one time. Long rest periods, depending on how strong you are as a 1A, the stronger you are, the more rest you're going to want, but you don't want to be doing anything in those rest periods that's intense. So as a 1A, you want to lift heavy, and then in your rest period, you want to rest long enough, like 3+ minutes, so that when you get back into that set, you can go very intense again. Very important. And then making sure that you're having measurable wins along the way, because that's what's going to mentally motivate them the most, is going PBs. So when you train like this, energy is going to go up. They're going to be motivated. They're going to look forward to them practices again, and they're not going to feel drained all the time, right? This is the biggest thing of a 1A in today's society, with so much stimulation that is like a little bit of stimulation all the time, is they just get drained, right? And this kind of leaves them in this very unhealthy, just kind of depleted state. Whereas what they need is, they don't want to be here in the middle zone all the time. What they need is, they need to be way up here in intensity and then way down here in terms of rest. So that's them. If 1As go into like CrossFit, some 1As go into CrossFit because they like the sound of the intensity, the competitive part of it. But then the methods in CrossFit are very grindy, very muscular, that kind of, just, you understand, like grindy, high volume, short rest periods. 1A's not going to last very long in a CrossFit program. Boot camps, same reason, hardcore, like Navy SEAL training, like that kind of program, not going to work for a 1A. What's also not going to work for 1A are things like yoga, Pilates, things like that are like, not necessarily like, not hard, but there's no competitive element of it. And there's no like way to record how you got better at that. And it's not stimulating in terms of like, it doesn't feel like a sprint doing a yoga or a Pilates thing. It's like, it's more like a marathon. And 1As are going to be very bored by those kind of things. So what usually happens is, they hit a wall, they get depleted, their energy crashes, sleep suffers, injuries, and then they kind of get into this point where they're like, oh my God, okay. Because they're feeling depleted, they'll go and seek activities like, eating, video games, drinking, all that kind of stuff to feed their need for that intensity, for that dopamine. So the fix is cut the volume, make sure you're resting long enough, and get chasing that intensity again. So if this is you, don't give yourself too many sets. Don't give yourself loads of exercises. Don't do, loads of sessions. You want to have fairly frequent sessions with a 1A. So if you take, as a 1A, if you take like 3 days off, when you get back into training again, you're going to feel terrible. So what's good for the 1A is having a high frequency. So if you can, not trying to take more than 1 or 2 days off. 48 hours in between workouts works really well. Having shorter workouts and doing it like 5 or 6 days a week can work really well. I still, for 1As that come into our programs, I still program 3 days a week, because a lot of the time, if you're swimming, you're getting that intensity from your pool sessions as well. So it's not just, you're not just lifting in your life, right? So if you were just lifting for the 1As, I would have programs that was maybe Monday, Tuesday, break on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, break on Sunday. But those sessions would be very, very short, like 20, 30 minutes. But the 3 days per week works quite well, because let's say you gym on Monday, you're swimming, maybe you're swimming most of those days as well, but you're still getting that intensity. You're usually not going more than 48, 72 hours without doing something intense, whether it's in the pool or in the gym. Make sure you track stuff, right? Again, that's pretty easy in our app, but if you're not going to join any of our stuff, then like make a logbook and record that stuff and see what you did last week, and record what your PBs are, and then try and beat those PBs every week. Just by a little bit. You're not gonna get PBs all the time. All that stuff. So the strategies in terms of lifting methods that are going to work really well for the 1A is you can keep similar lifts. So if you're doing, for example, a front squat, for your squatting pattern, you can keep the front squat for a very long period of time. Like you're probably not going to need to change the exercises very often. But what you might want to change is not the actual exercise, but the methods that you use in that exercise. So it might be that you do front squats, but for 6 to 9 weeks, you do normal reps where you're just, 1 or 2 seconds down, 1 or 2 seconds up. Then the next 6 to 9 weeks, you might do it where you're going 3 seconds down and then coming up. Or you might do it where you're going down to the bottom, pausing for 3 seconds and then coming back up. So you can try different tempos and pauses to add some variation, but the actual exercises don't need to change very often, right? The 1A doesn't care about, having new stuff all the time. They care about just being better and chasing those PBs. Low volume. So my general recommendations for low volume is going to depend where you're at, but what I would say is I would not do more than, as a rule of thumb for you, we break these rules in our personalized programs because I know what works, but trying to keep things very simple for the 1A, never do more than 2 or 3 sets of an exercise. Never do more than 2 or 3 sets of an exercise, and make sure that first of all, never do more than 2 or 3 sets. Never do more than 3 or 4 exercises, and they're compound exercises, right? So exercises where you're using large muscle groups. So the basics that we've talked about, squats, hinges, pushes, pulls, variations of those, but make sure that you're not doing any isolation exercises, because that's not going to excite you or benefit you very much. So, or if you do, keep them to, if you are doing accessory exercises for the 1A, keep them to like one hard set. If you are doing bicep curls, because that's a very weak point, then do one really hard set of bicep curls. That's it. Okay. But in general, keep it to compound lifts. Keep it to 3 or 4 exercises, no more. Keep it to 2 or 3 sets, no more. What we often start people with is 1 or 2 sets for the 1As. And then, as they increase strength and capacity and all that stuff, then we might increase it to 2 or 3 sets. Variation with the pause and tempos, but keep the exercises the same for longer periods of time, like 6 to 9 weeks. Make sure you're recording stuff so that in those exercises, you're trying to get a PB every week, right? And then the RPE for the 1As, for sets for the 1As, what I would recommend is what we've said before generally is to go to an RPE 8, 7 or 8 out of 10 effort. For the 1As, I would go for those sets, long rest periods, but for each working set that you're doing, not including your warm-ups, that's different. But for your working sets, I would go to a 9 RPE. So you're going to the point where you're leaving just like 1 rep in the tank. So your last rep is pretty hard, but you could do 1 more rep, probably. Intense, and that's going to feed the intensity. And then high frequency. So again, like we said, don't take more than 1 or 2 days of not having any intensity in your program, because it's going to take you a full session to get you back into the groove again. So shorter sessions, but more frequent. So questions, just a quick question that is going to kind of be a question as you're going through all of this. Like, if none of that has sounded like you, don't worry, because but if some of that has sounded like you, don't worry, like we're all a little bit of all the neurotypes. So what we want to focus on is not that, oh, I have some of this, I have some of this. We want to focus on the neurotype that is the most like you, your most dominant neurotype. So if you're like, oh, I feel like I'm kind of like 20% of this, and yeah, I kind of like some of that stuff, but then there's this one neurotype that I'm like, oh yeah, like 75 or 85% of that neurotype sounds like me, then that's your dominant neurotype, and that's the one that you should focus on when you're making your plans for training. So the dominant type is what we want to focus on. So if we've gone through the 1A and you're like, that's me through and through, I need intensity, I am the kind of person that loves to be dominant, and I love to win arguments, and this kind of training that you've just explained here sounds like it would motivate me, like I'm trying to win things all the time, very competitive, then awesome. Then the 1A might be the focus for you, and that's how you should structure your programs, focusing mainly on strength, a little bit of power work, potentially a little bit of accessory work, but keep them very short, and then mainly focus on just getting stronger. Like for the 1A, getting stronger is going to improve so many other areas of your life, and you're going to feel very good doing it. So that's the 1A. So type 1Bs, this is the, if there's one word to describe them, this is the explosive neurotype. So let me read through the traits quickly. They can have an explosive personality, but they're very calm most of the time, but can have explosive moments a few minutes later, and then they're chill again as if nothing happened. So they can go into, competition mode very quickly, and then they can get back to being very calm very quickly, up and down when they need to. They seek more intense, more thrilling activities like sports, gambling, that because of their competitive nature, because of their high sensitivity to dopamine, they're going to, if they're not getting that from their movement and from their sports and from their lifestyle, then they're going to seek it out in other areas that are maybe less healthy. They're constantly needing to try new experience, and they crave getting new knowledge. These are the people that are going to be wanting to take loads of courses or wanting to listen to loads of audio books that are non-fiction, right? These are the guys that want to learn all the time. Very high self-esteem, naturally, won't go out of their way to seek approval from others, but they're more aware of others than the type 1A. So they're a bit more chill than the type 1A, even though they have that big competitive aspect. They're very competitive, but not quite as extreme as the 1A, more likely to play it cool when losing or winning. So again, they're a bit more balanced than the 1A. Very easy learning new things, usually seen as the fast learners. They pick up new skills very quickly, which can be annoying for other people. They're the person that's like, oh my God, here they go again. It's so easy for them to pick things up. Fast, agile, and explosive, naturally better at using the stretch reflex than being particularly strong. So they're more likely to want to bounce in and out of strength exercises, bounce in and out of movements. They might not be as strong at heavy lifting as the 1A, because the 1A is more muscular driven, more kind of grindy through, whereas 1B's superpower is their bounce and their explosiveness. So when heavy lifting, particularly with the 1Bs, is very important that you allow yourself, if you're a 1B, allow yourself to use that bounce. It's not that you're cheating the rep, because if you don't do that, the amount of weight that you're lifting is going to go way down and the stimulus is going to be way lower. And you actually want to train that bounce. So it's actually fine to bounce in and out of positions as a 1B particularly, and a 2A as well. Good at focusing on one thing, but they're also good at switching quickly between tasks. So they can be seen as they have a good ability to multitask. Tend to be impatient, prefer to be doing something in the meantime if they're waiting for something. So they're the kind of guy that would, or the kind of girl that would, rather than waiting in line somewhere, they would rather take the long way round and be walking and be doing something. They hate waiting, like to be growing and improving and moving forwards constantly. Very goal-driven, not greatly affected by what others think of them as much as other neurotypes, but still able to take feedback into consideration. Very good under pressure. They perform their best when the stakes are high, same as the 1A. These are the kind of people that during a season, when the stakes aren't very high, they might struggle to get into the zone as much, get their arousal level high enough because the stakes aren't high enough. Whereas when they have their taper meet and when you get to nationals, or whenever the stakes are really high, that's when they perform their best and they pull it out of the bag. Loves to take risks and go all in on something completely different, as in starting over again, not scared to completely change something because they have put loads of work into something. Doesn't do well with authority and tends to take a less direct approach than a 1A to tackle it. So they might not necessarily argue with authority, but they might take a different approach around it. So the 1Bs are wired for speed bounce, reactivity, and fast movement. So the easiest way to think about for the 1Bs is the best way for them to get strong is to get explosive, right? To get faster. Common problems that really hurts 1B. So I'm a 1B, and one of the worst thing that I was ever happened to me for my training was doing long, slow training. It absolutely grinded my brain into mush because it wasn't engaging. Things weren't switching up long enough. It was very grindy. That's why I lost all my explosiveness and wasn't able to perform in the sprints. And then that's also why my longer events didn't get much better or any better, because I was basically overtrained. So the 1Bs can handle a bit more volume than the 1As for a short period of time. But just because they can doesn't mean that they should, right? Because they're able to do that, it's actually more important for them to make sure that they're not doing too much volume, because it's very easy for a 1B to get burnt out. So if this is resonating with you at all, if you're someone that has done, work hard programs that are kind of grindy and maybe higher volume, and you're just feeling beat up, like, this is probably why, right? Just reducing the volume of what you're doing is going to make you feel so much better, even though when you get to the end of a session, you might feel like you really want to do more. It's really important that you hold back and you actually save it for that next session, because first of all, it's going to keep your dopamine high so that you're looking forward to that next session. And it's also going to make sure that you don't, for a 1B, it's very easy to push yourself too hard. So it's very important to leave that session when you're feeling good and not go for those last few reps or those last few add in extra sets and things like this, because you will lose your explosiveness. You'll feel flat. You'll start to lose motivation. You'll start to want to not turn up, because also when you're not feeling great, you know that you're not going to, go a PB, and that's going to be hell for your dopamine. And then you start feeling terrible, and then you end up blaming your age. A lot of the time, that's what we've seen. So what they need is more speed, more intensity, lower volume, more variety in their sessions. And I don't mean necessarily like switching things up all the time, but more within a session. So what we tend to do in our newer programs and our personalized programs is we keep the main exercises the same for a 9-week block, but what we will do with every 3 weeks, we will change the method that we're using. So the first week, it might be for a 1B, let's say 3 sets of 6 reps with a normal tempo. And then 3 weeks later, it'll be the same exercises, but it might be 5 sets of 3 reps. And then the next week, it might be something where you're holding a pause at the bottom and then trying to bounce out of the bottom. So the exercise stays the same for a longer period of time, but the method that we use can change throughout that. But also within each session, we're switching up the power work that we would, for a 1B, we would do the power work before our strength work, because that will activate them and get them ready into the zone so their strength work becomes even better. So we would switch up the power work to be different every few weeks. And then the accessory work, if we're doing accessory work for that individual, if they had shoulder stuff or if they had mobility stuff that they wanted to work on, then the accessory work we would switch up as well to keep their mind fresh and that they're doing something new fairly regularly so they don't get bored by the workouts, but we're still keeping things consistent enough that they're able to improve over time, that they're not changing things up too much. And then, basically being more athletic. So if you're scared of being athletic and doing power type exercises because you've been told, oh, I'm old, so I can't do this kind of stuff, absolute nonsense. And it's actually probably more important for you as you get older, because speed is the thing that you lose the quickest, and it's the thing that the 1Bs need the most. So if you're a 1B or a 2A, power work is absolutely essential. And it's going to make you feel so much better when you start getting into that. And I don't mean going and doing Olympic lifts and jumping off crazy things. You need that power work, but you introduce it in a way that is you're starting at a lower level. So for example, we start our power work with very light altitude drops. So instead of doing a big jump or whatever, that's max effort that, you know, if you haven't done that in years, probably won't feel very good. What we start with would be something like, you know, stepping off a 6-inch box and then catching yourself. That's an impact activity, but it's a more manageable impact. You know, it's like stepping off the bottom of a step of stairs. And then as you get better at that, you increase the platform that you're stepping off over time, and you can add dumbbells and increase the weight and things like that. But it's, again, like we've said before, very easy progress, you know, slow progress in those things so that you can not hurt yourself and not be freaked out by, oh, I'm doing all this power stuff. But you'll be amazed at how quickly you can feel really good and start actually pushing yourself on that stuff, because especially for a 1B, your body is going to be craving that. It's going to be craving that bounce and that impact and that higher intensity stuff. It's going to feel really good. So don't be scared of that just because people have told you otherwise. So things that are going to work for the 1Bs is, less volume, more higher intensity strength and power work, lower reps. And again, it's not necessarily that we're going to do 1 rep max efforts on these stuff, but a 1B is probably not going to love doing a set of 15 reps, right? They're going to feel the burn in their muscles. They're going to feel drained. They're not going to feel very good on that. So for the 1Bs, for older populations, what we tend to do is we tend to start within the 5 to 10 reps range. And then as they get more comfortable and get stronger in there, then for certain phases, we might go into lower reps and lifting heavier weights, depending on the exercise, depending on the person, where they're at, how advanced they are, how comfortable they feel, and all that stuff. But in general, you want to have less volume in your sessions and more intensity, more explosive or heading towards explosive type work. So again, talked about this. We keep the main lifts fairly consistent in terms of the actual exercise, but then we switch it up in terms of the methods that we use. We rotate around the accessory exercises to keep things fresh, keep things new, keep things exciting. And we make sure that there's variety, but not in a way that you're constantly changing things up so that you're doing new exercises all the time, that you're super sore or anything. And that's why we do that on the main lifts. We keep the main lifts the same, because this is the stuff that if you're constantly changing up your main lifts too much, then you will be just sore a lot of the time and not necessarily progressing or seeing that progress over time. So that's the sweet spot. Enough change to stay engaged, but enough structure to keep progressing. Common mistakes with the 1B is similar to 1As, probably have similar problems, but they oftentimes will get stuck in the cycle of going to something that looks fun and engaging, like a CrossFit, because the variety of CrossFit might pull in a 1B, but then because CrossFit, the style of CrossFit training generally is very grindy and very, you're getting a lot of lactate in your system, that burn in your muscles. And that is particularly bad for a 1B. 1B is the neurotype that can tolerate lactate the least. So the burn exercises, things like that, are going to absolutely drain a 1B. You want to stay away from that as much as you can. As a 1B, there are only very particular little doses of that we would do, such as we use it sometimes with isometrics and things like that. But generally, we want to stay away from higher volume work or high volume or sets that are lasting too long, that we're going into that lactate, into that burn zone. And because they start doing that program, they get bored of how it is very quickly, because they're not seeing that progress and they're feeling terrible all the time. They end up just being like burning out and then going to do something else and constantly switching things up all the time, which means they don't see progress and all that kind of stuff. Nervous system going to be fried. They're going to not feel good. Their dopamine's going to go down. They're probably going to seek things like eating bad foods when they get to that burnout stage, which is going to make it harder to, maintain a good metabolism, maintain a healthy blood sugar. You're going to do all other activities that are also going to mess up with your blood sugar and all this stuff. Gambling, smoking, drinking, all those kinds of activities. Whereas when you get your training in check for the 1B, you're going to, if you have issues with that kind of stuff as 1B, if you get your training in check, you're much less likely to want to or need to feel satisfied by doing those unhealthier things, right? Because you're going to get what you need. Your nervous system is going to get what it needs from the training. So that's a really cool thing. And that's something that has been big in my life, is when I get my training in check in terms of making it right for me as a 1B, I eat way better, and I sleep way better, and I do less scrolling and all these things that are like where we're trying to feed our dopamine. So yeah, if you can get this right as a 1B, from my experience as a 1B, it can completely change so many other areas of your life. So can all of this stuff with all the neurotypes, to be honest. But yeah, that's a big one with the 1B. Intensity over fatigue, speed over grindy stuff. So in general, for the 1Bs, we tend to keep the reps lower. Most of the work, probably between 5 and 8 reps. But for older population, for younger people, we keep it under 5 reps. But for people that are not as confident in the gym, we still want to keep it 5 to 8, because that means that you're still going to get some intensity from it, but it's not going to be overwhelming. But then we would progress potentially at some point going down to below 5 reps or getting that in for shorter periods of time. Definitely having some power work in there, or even mixing up the strength work and the power work. So you might go from doing a set of 5 heavy-ish squats, and then resting a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and then going into some sort of jump exercise or some sort of lower body power exercise, and then going back to the squats and going between those two, making sure that you're resting long enough. But that can be something that works really well for the 1B, because it's giving you a bit of variety. So it's challenging you mentally, but it's also giving you a mix of power and strength work, and kind of marrying those two together so that you're kind of learning how to use that strength in a power scenario. That works quite well for a 1B. Doing competitions, and really important for a 1B to have something to like work towards. Even in training, if it's just like, hey, by the end of 6 months, I want to be able to do a pull-up, or I want to be able to get to 5 pull-ups body weight, or something like that. Like having a goal like that is very, very important. And then also celebrating the wins along the way is super important, because it gives you that little bit of competition, but also just doing competitions of some sort. Having a meet, having a swim meet that you want to perform at is going to be really useful, because then you have something to work towards, and that's going to be much more motivating. You're much more likely to enjoy turning up to practice when you have a goal. Recording stuff, because again, like we just said, getting those little wins where you can win the session, basically. Having some bounce in there where you're using your stretch reflex is going to be motivating. It's going to make things more fun. And you're going to be able to do way more in the gym, being able to do that. And it's going to also transfer to how you swim in the pool as well, because 1Bs are going to tend to use more bouncy type techniques. For instance, on butterfly, being able to, when you get into that stretch position, using the bounce, when you get into that catch position, kind of bouncing out of that catch position and then getting back into the stroke. Heavy lifts is going to be good, but again, not being super slow or grinding. We wouldn't use very much tempo work with 1Bs, because, if we're doing like a slow lower into the bottom of a, let's just use squats because it's an easy example. If you're going slow into the bottom of a squat with a 1B, if we ever did that, we would still allow them in that last little bit of the squat to go down and bounce out of that last bit, because we don't want to demotivate the 1B, because they're going to struggle with slower tempos and pauses because they can't use that bounce. Therefore, when they can't do that, they're going to use much lower weight. When they're using much lower weight, that is going to be demotivating for them. So we generally don't use slow tempo very often with 1Bs. And if we do, we still let them bounce out of the bottom. Having some variety within the workout. Again, we talked about that. And then for high frequency. So this is pretty important, is if you can help it as a 1B, it's better to do less more often, because doing a workout is going to activate, right? But when you get to 48, 72 hours later, if you take 2 or 3 days off as a 1B, when you get back in, you're almost going to waste a session kind of getting yourself amped up again. You're going to have basically a bad first session, right? You're only going to start feeling good towards the end of that session or the day after. So with a 1B, it's really important to make sure that you're trying not to have more than 1 or 2 days off. What we tend to do in our programs for the 1Bs is we have 3 days per week still, but we try to make sure that, first of all, what we tend to do is we tend to say, if you're training on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we would say, do your higher intensity swims on the same day that you're doing your lift. That means that you can have a day of recovery. So on Tuesday, Thursday, you would be recovering, and then you can go higher intensity on the Wednesday, Friday again. But we would also say, one day on the weekend, make sure that you're doing some sort of high intensity swim there as well, if you can, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just doing like one or two 25s fast or 150 fast or something. Do something that is activating so that you're not having 2 days off on the weekend. Because if you take 2 days off on the weekend, chances are on the Monday, you're going to be not feeling great. And it's going to take Monday's session to get back into the flow of things. So this way, if you make sure that you're doing at least a little bit of something, even if you go in and do a warm up and do just a quick little something, a little bit twitchy, something explosive, you're going to feel so much better on the day after. So try not to take more than a day in between if you can. Because you're going to make much faster progress. You're going to feel much better. And when you get to that point, from my experience as 1B, when you get to that point, if you've taken 2 days off, it's so much harder on that third day or that fourth day to get back into things. You just kind of like, oh God, I know I'm going to have a bad session. I know, but I've just got to do it. It's way less motivating. So it's much better to keep things more frequent and keep those sessions shorter. So you're feeling good all the time, which is very, very important for the type 1B. So type 2A. Type 2As are called the chameleons because everything works, but nothing works for a long time. And they tend to be highly motivated by earning the respect and admiration of others, which means that what happens a lot of time is they adapt very well in social situations. So they will mirror people. They will change their personality based on what they think is going to please the other person. So they're very likable. They're oftentimes have loads of friends. They're a lot of the time fairly extroverted and love to be around people. They're often the life of the party. So let me just go through this list so that you can get an idea, see if this is you. Tend to mimic the behavior of the person in front of them, do whatever is needed to be liked or appreciated by the person that they're with. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're do that all the time or that you have to do that, but it's just something that you tend to do that feels natural. Doesn't like going into large groups if they don't know any or many of them. Hates to feel left out. Lower self-esteem at rest when adrenaline is low. Doesn't take much adrenaline to boost them into a higher self-esteem, but they can easily choke if there's too much. So they tend to be people that come out of their shell in social situations, especially if they want to feel like the person, right? That everyone knows, that everyone's going to, that everyone likes. Wants to get along with everybody. Great at creating different personalities based on the situation. Sometimes it can be hard to get the truth out of them because they're so excited to make plans with you face to face, but then they might cancel plans later on because they don't want to hurt your feelings. So can often be people pleasers. Again, not necessarily all the time if that's something that you've like worked on or that you've wanted to change, but naturally that's something that they would do. Great at reading people so they know how to respond in an appropriate way. Needs to create reciprocity with the person they're talking to, So when someone is talking, they'll say, no way, same thing happened to me. Things like that. Want others to think of them very highly. A little appreciation goes a very long way with a 2A. One compliment can be remembered by them for a long time. It means a lot to them. Losing face is very destructive for them. Making fun of them, even as a joke, can hurt their feelings and reduce their self-esteem. Tends to mimic the most influential person around them. They tend to pick up accents of the people they're around very quickly, things like that. Imitating professional athletes can be a great way to motivate them and get them to understand techniques or mindsets, because they're able to put themselves in the place of the other person, like just physically as well as mentally and emotionally. Doesn't like to make decisions because they don't want to upset people, as they need to be liked. That's the people pleaser side of them. Needs variation and change. Procrastinates and does better work last minute. So basically what this means in training for these kinds of people. So if this sounds like you, then stick around. This is probably something useful for you. One more thing that I will say about the 2A is if you do our personalized programming, you get to our neurotype test. If you have very even split of all the neurotypes, that can also be a sign that you're a 2A, because you are very adaptable and change based on the situation that you're in and change based on the people that you're around and things like that. So depending on when you take the test or how you think about taking that test, you could have different answers depending on what situation you're in. So what happens with 2As is sometimes they don't come out as a 2A as their dominant neurotype, but they have a very balanced mix of all of the types, or 2 or 3 or 4 of the types. If this doesn't sound like you're like, I'm not a people pleaser, but you resonate with a lot of parts of all of the neurotypes fairly strongly, then, or if you think that you're a big mix of all the neurotypes, then you're probably a 2A, because the 2A is able to adapt and all that stuff and change. So the 2A thrives on variation is the biggest thing with the 2As. So if that's you, you probably understand that variation, novelty, changing things up all the time. Often 2As can be the people that are the biggest like program hoppers, or people that are join one gym and then the next month they join a different gym and things like that, or they're into a new thing all the time in terms of training and other things that you're into. But yeah, variation, novelty, change, because everything works for them, right? But for a short period of time. So if you don't bake that into your training, what can happen is you can get very bored of your training and burn out, or you get bored of a program very quickly and then you move out of it just as it's starting to work, things like that. And then because you're constantly switching up, you're always in the starting phase of everything that you're doing. So with the 2A, it's really important to bake into a long-term plan, to bake in that variation and make sure that you're feeling like you're working on something new a lot of the time. They have a very balanced nervous system versus muscular versus neurological. So they can't do a lot of very high intensity work like a 1A or a 1B, but they can't do a lot of grinding like a 2B. So they're kind of this mix in the middle. So in sessions for 2As, we want to mix up the methods and stuff as we go along, but within a session, we want a good mix of neurological work, as in like higher intensity stuff, but not too much high intensity stuff. Then we want a mix of more muscular work, more, like isolation moves or things where you are feeling a burn in the muscles and getting a bit of lactate in there. 2As are going to do well having periods of time where they're focusing more on lactate work, having periods of time where they're focusing more on strength work, having periods of time where they're focusing more on power style work, having different areas of the season where they're focusing more on mobility, things like that. And then using loads of different methods throughout that can keep them engaged and keep them feeling good, right? Because if they just do the neurological work, if they just do the high intensity work, and they do a lot of that, they're going to feel drained because their nervous system can't handle a lot of high intensity work. But they need a bit of that to increase their adrenaline and pump them up a bit. but then they also need a bit of muscular work to also give them energy and a bit of adrenaline in a different way, and to give them that kind of a bit of a pump feeling, to give them a bit of mind muscle connection. And they're going to need that more sometimes. But again, not too much of it. They need to kind of mix all this stuff in and have a different focus. So what we tend to do for 2As is we tend to have like a 3-week focus on one specific area. So 3 weeks, it might be the main strength exercise is the main focus. Then 3 weeks later, we might do slightly less of the strength work, and we focus more on mobility or isometrics or power work, or we focus more on more volume on the accessory work or things like that. So every 3 weeks, we're switching up the focus, but we're still keeping all the stuff in that we need to for them to keep progressing. So we never take anything out completely. It's just the area that we focus on will change every 3 weeks. That's what we do. That seems to work best for the 2As. So the biggest issue with the 2As is not discipline, and it's not 2As can handle they can handle like the highest or the second highest of all the neurotypes in terms of volume. They can do a lot of volume. The thing that burns out a 2A is boredom and mental stimulation. And when your mind is out of it, then your body's going to respond physically to that. But if you stay engaged with your practices, if you can write practices in a way that they stay fun, they stay engaging, they stay fresh and novel and new a lot of the time, or it feels that way, then they can handle actually a lot more volume than the average person. Like Chad Leclos, Olympic champion, when I was working with him, he was able to handle lots of stuff, but it was keeping his mind and keeping his brain engaged in the training. So me and his swim coach would basically keep switching things up fairly regularly, and then we were able to push him further quicker because his brain was engaged. Because it was fun for him to keep doing new style stuff and keep switching that up. So it's getting this balance of structure and long-term outcomes that we want, and keeping the variety along that journey. So I've talked about this. So yeah, what we want is long-term progress with novelty along the way. You know, it's a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down. And when you do that, motivation is going to stay high. You're going to look forward to practice, and it's going to be, you're going to feel better throughout that process, especially if you keep the balance within each session as well. Oftentimes, the pattern that 2As can get stuck in, as I explained before, starting new things all the time. You don't want to be starting new things all the time, but you do want to feel like you're trying slightly new versions of things all the time. Craves new challenges. Without structure, you're going to be constantly restarting, never building anything long-term. 2A mistakes is that going all in or all out for short periods of time. What you want to do is you want to set something up long-term that you know along the way that is going to be fun for you to turn up to for a long term. They're going to burn out from extreme things for longer periods of time, but they can go to extremes, but just for short periods of time. And we say about 3 weeks for that, 2 or 3 weeks. Blend the neural and muscular work. Shift's going to focus every few weeks. So that's the 2As. This is kind of the hardest one to give specific advice for, because it's like, do something a bit new every 2 or 3 weeks, but not too new. So it's kind of hard to give a structure for the 2As, because our structure for the 2As changes fairly regularly. But the biggest focus that I would say is keep in your main strength training, and then play about with the power work that you're doing at the start of your sessions. For the 2As, I'd recommend doing at the start of your sessions, or mixing it in with your strength work. So similar to the 1Bs, you could do a set of squats and then rest a few minutes, and then do a power, some sort of jumping exercise, and then go back to the squats and do sets like that. So you integrate the power work into your strength training, but then you're also going to want to have periods where you separate those out, because that's going to feel different. It's going to be a different challenge to your body. And then playing about with different focuses on, after you've done that main work, different focuses on different types of accessory work. So it might be that for 3 weeks, you really focus on building hip mobility, right? Focusing on hip mobility exercises, or shoulder mobility, or core strength, or, you know, wherever it might be. Pick a different focus every 3 weeks or so that you have your main block that is taking care of the 20%, that's taking care of the 80% of the results, right? And switching that up, using different reps and sets and things for that to keep that part engaging, but not changing that too much. And then the stuff that you can change is the accessory work. So you have something to look forward to that's a bit new as well. And then that'll keep you engaged as well as you go through the 2A. Again, sorry, it's kind of difficult without like writing the program for you to give you different examples of this, because you just want to be changing it up very regularly. So that's the 2As, right? If this sounds like you, then that's the biggest thing I would say is your biggest problem is going to be that you're going to want to do something new all the time. So make sure that you bake that in to your training so that you can still see the progress. When you're recording, you're still getting stronger all the time on those main lifts, but you're having sugar to help the medicine go down with that. You're having something new to look at that you're doing that. Another thing that can really help with 2As is having some sort of community or some people that you can talk to kind of hold you accountable, because you want that that community aspect, that like feeling, you know, like we have 2As in our community in our app, or for our personalized and our private group, and they love like saying, hey, here's the workout that I did, here's what I did this week, you know, how's everyone else going? And that social aspect of things, like when with other people that are doing the same thing as you, can be really helpful. So if you don't join our stuff, get a group of friends, or, you know, find some people that want to do a similar thing, and then hold each other accountable. And then that part, that like social aspect of, you know, holding each other accountable, but also being like, hey, pat me on the back, look what I did, I, you know, stayed accountable to this. That's also going to be really helpful for a type 2A as well. Cool, that's the 2As. So the type 2B, the one word to describe the type 2B is sensation. And we'll get into that why. Let me just read off some of the traits of this so you can get a feel for if this is, if you're a type 2B, or if this is one of your dominant neurotypes. So generally lower self-esteem, great at reading people, more introverted, but still needs to respect and approval of others. They can become more extroverted when they feel good and when their adrenaline increases. Much better one-on-one, can make you feel very important. Just in terms of social stuff. So 2Bs still, like the 2As, it's important for people to like and respect them. But the 2Bs tend to not necessarily as extroverted and trying to be friends with everybody and changing themselves too much for everybody. 2Bs tend to have fewer but very strong emotional connections with, so they tend to have fewer friends but really strong connections with those friends. And they tend to be the neurotype that is like, I would do anything for the people around me. They're the good guys, are often seen as that because they often give up parts of themselves to help other people. They often sacrifice themselves. So that's just something to understand there. Very emotional, very easy to fall in love. They get feelings very quickly. They love to dress well and look good. One important thing to understand is that, like, bodybuilders, for example, the majority of bodybuilders are type 2Bs because they get into bodybuilding because they want to look good, because that's going to, you know, looking good is one of the easiest, quickest ways to get respect from people and to have people like you. But yeah, oftentimes 2Bs, like when we're programming for the 2Bs, usually when we get 2Bs in our personalized program, like the type 1s generally aren't bothered very much about aesthetics. But when it comes to the 2Bs, the aesthetics part is actually quite important. They're like, I want to get strong for swimming, I want to get mobile, and I want to feel better and all that stuff. But I also want to look good. So a lot of time they'll say like, oh, I want to increase my muscle in certain areas. And yeah, they want to look good. Appearance is important for them. Likes displays of emotion and likes grand gestures. So if you're a 2B, chances are you're going to enjoy a big grand proposal. Things like that. You know, someone bringing you flowers or things like that. Not that, who doesn't like getting flowers? They give everything to their close relationships. They're seen as the good guy because they're people pleasers a lot of the time, even more than the 2A, but just in a different way. They can be seen as weak because of this. They want to avoid disappointing people at all costs. Their greatest need is to be liked, desired, or admired. They're great at listening to others and helping them. They don't feel very comfortable in a leader position. They'll often be a really great support for a leader, but they don't like to take that role, again, similar to the 2A, because they don't want to disappoint people with decisions that they make. But they can be great listeners. They can be great for morale in a team, sort of saying. Will work harder than everybody else if they think it'll earn them respect. So in swim programs, a lot of the time, these are the grinders, the people that work really hard in training, but because, well, we'll get into that in a minute, sacrifice their well-being for the good of others a lot of the time. Most prone to choking under pressure. So this kind of goes with the working hard. Like oftentimes these will be the swimmers, the 2Bs, that work really hard in practice. You know, they go best times in practice, but then they get to a competition and they go slower than they go in practice. And that's because they have lower self-esteem, they have higher anxiety than a lot of the other neurotypes. And because of that, it's very easy for their anxiety to go too high to the point where they actually get too tight, they get too, you know, and also on top of that, because they're performing for respect and admiration of others, that can increase the anxiety even more. Yeah, this is why they tend to struggle in competitions to keep their arousal levels low. So for a 2B in competition, it's important for them to try to calm themselves down. Whereas for the type 1As and the 1Bs, they want the stakes to be as high as possible because that gets them into the correct arousal level. Whereas for the type 2B, they're on this side of the equation, so they need to calm themselves down to get into the optimal arousal level and say things like, nerves are good, it doesn't matter if I screw up, it's just me in my lane and all that kind of stuff. Whereas for the type 1s, it's like, I'm racing everyone else. You know, they don't want a whole lot of variation in their program, and they tend to like to stick with exercises or sets of rep schemes that they like. So very different to the 2A in that respect. So 2Bs like a bit more predictability in their program, and I think you can kind of start to see the difference. So when we go from the type 1s to the type 2s to the type 3s, generally what happens is self-esteem gets lower as they go across, and anxiety, like just a normal resting anxiety level, gets higher. So type 3s are the most anxious, but type 2s are the second most anxious. So that is why with nutrition strategies, with training strategies, we want to do things that don't freak them out, right? And that's why for the type 2s, the type 2Bs, we want their plan to be a bit more structured and not be too spontaneous and not be switching things up very often. It's better to have a simple progression, simple plan that kind of gradually increases over time. Cool. So what are they motivated by? 2Bs, because they're a bit more, these are the kind of people that are going to do better on like a traditional kind of grind program. These are the people that actually, in terms of training, the traditional swimming approach is actually not terrible for them. As in, they're going to handle it better than other neurotypes because it gives them, like, they can handle a higher volume and they want to grind, they want to work hard, because feeling like the sweat, feeling the burn, feeling the pump, feeling the fatigue makes them feel like they worked really hard. These are the people that want to work hard because that's what motivates them, probably more than going PBs, more than getting stronger week on week. They're the people that want that, okay, I feel absolutely exhausted. That was a good workout. They're emotionally driven, very emotionally driven, because of their high glutamate levels. So I will do something on nutrition for the different neurotypes, but when glutamate is very high, like the 2Bs have a lot of glutamate naturally, because of that, that's why they get so emotional. But it's also why a lot of 2Bs, when they start like a diet that gets rid of carbohydrates and things like that, it's not because of necessarily the low carbohydrates, it's because they reduce the glutamate in their system, and then that makes them emotionally more stable. So that's just an interesting point that kind of explains a bit more why 2Bs are emotional. But it's also, if you are very emotional and you're a 2B and all this is making sense to you, chances are it's because the glutamate levels, the neurotransmitters in your brain, is very high. So that's actually something that you can take care of with nutrition strategies. Like, you don't want to go on like a low carb thing for like forever. You don't have to do that, and I don't recommend that at all. But there are other ways, and just eating things that are less processed and have less filler stuff in them, eating more natural stuff, particularly for the 2Bs, is going to make a massive, massive difference because of that glutamate thing, in terms of balancing them out emotionally and then feeling better as well because of that. Needs training to feel good. So this is why they're the sensation neurotype, because they want to feel the workout, right? They want to have a good mind-muscle connection. If they're doing a bicep exercise, they want to be in that muscle, feeling that muscle burn. This is also why we tend to use higher reps and sets for the 2Bs, but we'll get into that. So yeah, it's in terms of motivation, it's very important. And again, why 2Bs tend to be more consistent on like a bodybuilding program is because feeling that burn is really motivating for them, or for you if you're a 2B. And that's what bodybuilding programs tend to do. A lot of 2Bs tend to be drawn to the bodybuilding programs because they want to look better. Oftentimes, what they miss out on is actually building strength and stuff. They end up building the muscle part, but then they don't fill it in with strength, which is something that we do. So their main needs are feel the workout, muscular fatigue, getting a pump, being in the muscle, that mind-muscle connection, and developing respect, like doing things in a way that they feel like they're going to earn respect. So that's why they're drawn to bodybuilding. Can be Pilates, because Pilates is pretty hard, but it's something that you're feeling it a lot. And a lot of people go into Pilates to tighten their belly or whatever. Not the best approach if aesthetics is your main goal, or function in everyday life, but that's why people are drawn to Pilates a lot of the time. And then they can handle higher volumes in the pool, but not necessarily just doing lots of slow swimming. 2Bs tend to enjoy things like best average sets, 10-100 best average, where you're working really hard, but it's not super intense. It's not like you're sprinting like 25s, because that actually is going to increase their anxiety. But they like a best average set because, first of all, it gives them time for their adrenaline to increase throughout the set. So often the 2Bs are the kinds of people that are going to get better as a set goes on, because as their adrenaline increases, their performance is going to increase. But also at the same time, with a predictable set like a 10-100's best average or something like that, they know what's coming. So because they can predict what's coming, their anxiety is going to be reduced because of that. And then they're going to be able to push harder and harder as their adrenaline goes up. So they tend to finish sets really strong, and people think that, oh, you're saving yourself for the end of that set. when really they were trying hard throughout the whole set, but as their adrenaline increased, they were able to perform better. And because of the predictability, their anxiety wasn't too high. Yeah. So don't mistake this for the 2Bs liking intensity, because threshold work and grinding and getting out of breath is the opposite of intensity, right? Intensity is something that's short and fast and maximal effort. That's what the type 1's like. The type 2Bs with the short, fast, maximal effort stuff, first of all, doing too much of that high neural stuff, because 2Bs are more muscular than nervous system. They're more muscle than the neurological. They are going to be very drained. They're going to find it very hard to recover from very high intensity work. But they actually do really well with lactate, because they're going to feel that lactate, and it's much, much easier for them to recover from those lactate sessions, those like hard work grind sessions. The intensity is lower, but they're the ones that actually don't do terrible being in this middle ground of intensity, where they're working hard, they're getting out of breath, they're feeling the burn, but not that they get super bored from doing really long, low volume stuff, but they need to feel that workout. So yeah, that tends to be what 2Bs are drawn to in the pool. And they care about aesthetics, how things feel, people admiring them. The problem with a lot of, 2Bs tend to be the people that do better on traditional programs that are kind of more grindy, or bodybuilding programs that are very grindy. Often the missing piece in those programs is integrating the higher intensity stuff, is integrating the actual strength work. So for a 2B, for instance, building muscle is actually a very good strategy for them to build strength. So you build this base of muscle, but what we need to do is we need to use that muscle and then turn it into functional strength, right? But we don't want to do it with very high intensities like we would want to do with the type 1As, the 1Bs, and 2As for certain periods of time. 2Bs are we almost never do very maximal effort things with 2Bs. If we are working with 2Bs, often in terms of reps and sets, so generally what we might do with 2Bs is set our season up into different phases, where in the beginning, we spend a lot of that phase building functional hypertrophy, where we're focusing on building muscle, but building muscle in a way that it's still transferring to building strength. So, for instance, instead of doing sets of 15 to 20 reps where you would be feeling the burn, but not necessarily getting very strong from it, we would instead use sets of, say, 10 reps, because it's not super high intensity, because the reps are high enough that you can't lift as heavy a weight, but you're spending more time in the set so that by the time you get to the end of 10 reps, you're feeling the burn, but it's still heavy enough to start building a bit of strength. But then as we get closer towards meets or taper meets, or just filling in that strength, we might go down to 8 reps for a set, for instance, and then it becomes a little bit less muscular. It's still muscular, you're still in the building hypertrophy, still building muscle zone, but it's a little bit more intense, and you're going to be building a little bit more strength with 8 reps. And then we go down, like the least we would go down to is 5 or 6 reps for the 2Bs. And we would only do that for short periods of time, like the 2 weeks leading into a meet. And we keep the volume of that stuff very low as well. So we wouldn't be doing like 5 sets. We'd be doing like probably 1 or 2 sets of 5 or 6 reps. And then we would go back to doing a couple more sets of 8 reps or something like that, so that we're just spicing in a little bit of strength work, and that's going to quickly fill in the strength, but they build that foundation of muscle, and yeah, basically that. They fill in the foundation of muscle first while building a bit of strength, and then we fill in the strength later in a short period of time. That tends to work best for the 2Bs. Yeah, kind of staying between this 8-rep range, like moderate loads. We never go to like really high loads with the 2Bs because, first of all, it's going to fry their nervous system. They're going to feel really drained after that, and it's not going to be very motivating for them. So we balance. We don't even really do any neural work. We do have power exercises with our 2Bs, but we only do like 1 or 2 sets and we keep it very minimal. And what we tend to do is we tend to put those sets later on in the workout as well. So they're a little bit fatigued from the strength work that they've been doing, so that by the time they get to later in their set, first of all, they're warmed up, their adrenaline's higher, they're ready to go, but also they're a little bit fatigued. So it's going to be a good mix when they do get into the power work. They're going to get the benefits that they need from the power work, but it's not going to be so intense that it like fries their nervous system, things like that. They're going to be more warmed up, more prepared for it, but it's going to hurt them less. And we only do 1 or 2 sets of power exercises. We put them later on in the workout, and then we do our accessory exercises after that. And when we do that, when we focus more on muscles, we almost think about training 2Bs as like bodybuilding, but for swimming, right? So we have like our Jack Speed program, which is another program that we have that is aimed at building muscle without getting you sluggish and slow for the pool. And we use a lot of methods that we use from that with the 2Bs. And it tends to work really, really well for them. And then, we've had a lot of 2Bs that have gone on to other programs where they're doing less volume and that would work really well for maybe any of the other types. With the 2Bs, they actually swim the fastest when they're doing the Jack Speed program, when they're doing these methods that are more building muscle and building strength as a side effect. But we don't go to just building muscle for the sake of it. We have that balance, and that's why it works really well with athletes and with swimmers that are 2Bs. So it's a bit of sugar to help the medicine go down. It's building hypertrophy, doing something that you know is going to make you look good. You're going to feel the sensation of that workout. You're going to enjoy it because you're working hard. But it's also going to transfer to performance because we're still getting a bit of that strength work in as well. And then, mobility and all those other things that transfer to the pool. But we get them in the right doses. Mistakes for the 2Bs. A lot of 2Bs end up just doing bodybuilding workouts or doing, things like Pilates or things because they like that social interaction. They like being in places where they're able to create social connections and things, but they also tend to, because of this, they're doing programs that are not necessarily performance based as well. Like they don't have that performance aspect of it, which is going to lead to poor long-term transfer to the pool in the future as well. So the best way to do 2Bs in terms of training is to balance, don't worry about too much about doing high intensity or too much power work. You could probably not do almost any power work and still get really good power results just by building a bit of muscle, but building it functionally in a way that is going to transfer to naturally being more powerful anyway because you're stronger. We tend to do more sets with the 2B, so they have more time to build into the session, and we kind of build into that final set, which is the hardest set, because that's going to feel better for them. They're going to feel their muscles working in it. So we tend to do more sets. We keep our power work or our high intensity stuff very short, or, not much of it, or we integrate it into a bit more of something that's a bit longer of a burn. But then for our accessory work, we use, again, more, it's okay to focus more on a bit of bodybuilding for those smaller exercises. It might actually improve your strength gains in other areas for a type 2B. But most important, that extra pump work where we're doing slightly higher reps, like 10 to 15 reps or whatever it might be, for things like your biceps, triceps, shoulders, maybe a bit of extra work for the glutes or whatever it might be that you're trying to bring up to help you look good, or core work or something like that. That work is the most important part of that, having that work in the program, is because it's going to motivate you, because it's going to give you this little extra boost in terms of aesthetics and building muscle in areas that are going to help you look good and feel good, because you're getting a bit of the burn in there as well. But that's the most important part, is that it's going to motivate you and it's going to be something that you're going to look forward to. But it's just the biggest thing with the 2Bs is balancing that stuff that you like, that is fun, with stuff that is actually going to get you stronger, more powerful, and more athletic. So that's the 2Bs. So type 3s, the one word to describe the type 3 is control. So let me go through the list of traits and then have a think, is this you or not? And as we go through, I'll explain how this relates to training. So type 3s, usually introverted, unless they feel in control of the situation or have a lot of experience in that situation. Can be uncomfortable when too relaxed, because they let their guard down, and then that opens them up to scariest things. Can struggle to adapt due to high levels of cortisol naturally. So they're naturally the most anxious neurotype of all of them. So the reason that they need all this control and stuff is to manage their anxiety, to bring their anxiety down. So when things are more predictable, their anxiety is going to be reduced. Chronic overthinkers function better when following a structure or a routine, doesn't deal well with unexpected changes in a plan. They're very objective, but less intuitive. They like to think through a problem rather than feel the way through a problem. They hate taking risks. They're not thrill seekers, love playing it safe, prefer repetition over novelty or variation. They're a great observer and information gatherer, because extra information reduces their anxiety. They like to intellectualize decisions, again, rather than like going with their gut necessarily. They don't tend to talk a lot unless enough data is gathered to have an opinion. So these are the kinds of people that won't be in your face. You know, you're probably not in people's faces telling people this is how it is. You're more the observer type, and you're more, well, actually, you know, here's the facts, stating the facts, giving a good breadth of information around it. They can be secretive about sharing information with others, because they want to hold their cards close to their chest, because the more they reveal, the more vulnerable they leave themselves. Don't like thrills, less inclined to create social connections, not because they don't crave social connections, but because, similar to the 2B, they tend to have closer friends. They're not that worried about what people think about them. They're more concerned with keep maintaining their energy and keeping themselves low anxiety. And oftentimes, certain social situations that would increase your anxiety, they're not going to be wanting to do that. They can have very extreme focus and concentration. They're very patient. They need to feel in control to push themselves hard enough to progress. That's very important. And they have the lowest capacity to recover from high intensity work. So basically what the type 3 needs to make sure that they don't overtrain, because it's very easy for a type 3 to overtrain if they don't manage their loads very well, if they don't manage their cortisol, if they don't manage their recovery well, because they're the least able to recover from very high intensity work. So we don't tend to do lots of high intensity work. We don't mix things up too much. We make sure that we're progressing things very gradually in very small steps. And we make sure that there's a plan, a bigger plan, to be able to see where they're going next. So they need structure, they need predictability, they need a clear plan, because the randomness is going to increase their anxiety. Doing new things, first of all, having loads of different exercises in a workout, having loads of things changing up all the time, as much as that is craved by certain other neurotypes, it's something that increases your arousal level. It increases your anxiety, increases your cortisol. And for the type 3, we want to reduce that as much as possible, because for the type 3, they're already on this high arousal state because of their higher anxiety. So everything we do, we want to be reducing their anxiety to bring them into the optimal arousal state for them. And we want to reduce their anxiety because that anxiety for them is going to kill their recovery, it's going to kill their motivation, and it's going to kill their consistency, because they want to be consistent and they will keep turning up, but it's going to make it so hard for them to turn up when they're just feeling drained and burnt out all the time. So what do we do with a type 3? Training for a type 3 to make sure that we're doing all of this stuff is we want to, again, use our bang for buck lifts, because we don't want to use loads of lifts in a workout. So we keep, again, kind of similar to the type 1s, we want to keep to a few exercises, but the type 3, we can do higher volumes of those same exercises. And in fact, that's going to be better for the type 3, because more sets doing an exercise means more time with that exercise, more time where you can gradually do more warm-up sets, more sets where you're getting familiar with the workout, learning how to do it technically better, which is going to be something good for a type 3 to focus on, is the technique aspect, and then gradually increasing the intensity over the sets. So gradual progression over a period of time, but also within the session as well. So for a type 3, we would tend, for our main strength exercises, we would tend to not use more than 3 or 4 maximum, because we're going to do more sets of those, but we're not going to go straight into hitting our 8 out of 10 straight from the first set. We're going to start our sets at like a 6 out of 10, and then go to a 6.5 out of 10, and then a 7 out of 10, and then work our way up to that final set where you've warmed yourself up, you know how it's going to feel, it's increased a little bit each time, it's predictable. So that by the time you get to that last set or two that are the harder sets, the ones where you're making the biggest difference, you're warmed up to it, you understand the technique, you know what's going on, so it's going to produce less anxiety. Minimal variation. We don't want lots of variation with the type 3s. So we keep exercises pretty much very similar for 9-week period, and then we might change the exercise, but usually we'll go 2 or 3 9-week blocks with the same main exercises, and we might change the accessory exercises every 9 weeks or 6 to 9 weeks or something like that, because that variation is going to feel like they're starting again. It's something that's new, and that new thing is going to be more anxious, more anxiety provoking for them. So we have minimal variation for the type 3s. Longer warm-ups. We don't like long warm-ups. We like to get straight into things. So what we do with the type 3s is we just actually we do more sets of the exercise, and then we just build into those sets. So we're doing higher volume work, more sets with the same exercises. Slower tempos and pauses. So because the type 3s like to be in control, they like to feel in control of the weight, using slower tempos and using pauses through different parts of the lift, or at the bottom or halfway up or whatever, can help them feel more in control of that lift. So slower tempos and pauses are, again, going to be more attractive for them. And that's something that we might switch up even over the 9-18-week phases. We might keep the exercises the same, but we might switch up the tempos of it. So, it might be that we have 3 weeks where we're doing, or 6 weeks where we're doing a 5-second lower in a rep and then pushing up. And then the next 6 weeks we might have where you're going down at a normal pace, but you're pausing at the bottom for 3 seconds and then launching up. Things like that, because it allows them to feel it. They're not feeling out of control, right? Nothing's going too fast for them to something to be unpredictable to happen. Longer rest periods, because of their natural high cortisol levels, using a longer rest period is going to manage that. So for big lifts, first of all, using lower intensities in the earlier sets and still resting like 2 or 3 minutes between those sets is going to keep the cortisol low. But then as you get to those sets where you're going for like an 8 out of 10 effort, you're going to want to rest even longer for those. And then also what really works well for type 3s in particular is in those rest periods, doing things that are gonna calm you down. So things like doing a bit of light stretching, or doing some foam rolling, or, just some meditation or some breathing, something that's going to bring you down very quickly, is going to work really well for the type 3s. I like to put stretching in for the type 3s in their rest periods, because it's something that forces you to breathe. It forces you to be focused on a sensation in a certain area of your body, and it kind of helps calm you down, which the type 3 needs to have a big focus on those rest periods and calming things down. But they also need to have a focus. So focusing on something, focusing on control, mastery, confidence in an exercise, or technique in an exercise is going to make them feel, that's what's going to motivate them, is getting better technically, or getting, not necessarily lifting more weight. That will happen over time, and that's what we want over time, but doing it with a greater range of motion, or, doing it with a slower tempo, or that's how they're going to progress better, is rather than being like, look at me, I lifted more weight. It's actually, I'm lifting the same weight, but I'm taking slightly longer to do it. And that's another way to build strength. So mastering the technique, mastering all those things are going to keep the type 3 motivated. But most importantly, like type 3s, we don't have to worry as much about motivation, because you're tending to want to do this stuff. You want to be precise and organized and consistent. It's more about making you keep your anxiety level low, and making sure that you don't burn out in that process while we're still getting some good training in. So common mistakes that type 3s make in general out in the world is not doing strength training because they're scared of doing strength training, because they see it as this big high intensity thing. But if you do it in the way that we do it for type 3s, if you do it in a way that you're not changing things up too much, so you know what exercises you're doing, we build into those exercises, so you're never going straight into a hard set or anything like that. You're only getting a little bit more intense over time through those sets. Those are ways to keep your anxiety level low and build proficiency, mastery of those exercises over time, and still build strength without necessarily doing things that are super high intensity. Like, we don't do super high intensity work with type 3s. And if we do, we keep it very, very minimal, like one set, something like that. Because it is important to get a little bit of power work and a little bit of high intensity stuff every once in a while, but we don't want that to be the basis of the program. Most of the program needs to be very structured and easy to just do. Type 3s can also handle the highest volume, so you don't have to go as tense with it with type 3s, because you can do more work and still recover from it as long as it's not super intense. Like type 3s are built for more endurance type events. They're going to be attracted to more endurance type events. Other mistakes that they make is not having a structured plan or not knowing what they're doing. So it's very important for a type 3. Like, type 3s are probably one of the neurotypes that benefit the most from having a coach to help them through that stuff, because then they don't have to guess that they're doing the wrong kinds of stuff. Or they go and, another mistake that a type 3 can make is they go and research loads of stuff, but then because they've done all this research and they have so many contradicting ideas about what to do, that they end up being even more confused, and they make a plan, but they're not sure if the plan, and then they get to this overthinking state of whatever. So it's really important for a type 3, or it can be very beneficial for a type 3 to have a coach and have someone that does the plan for them, and they just have to trust and stick to that plan. Not recording progress. If you're not recording as a type 3, it's going to be very demotivating, because I think for type 3s, like, you want to progress not just in terms of increasing the weight, but also like recording your videos of you lifting, so you can see technical aspects that you can improve on, and getting video feedback on that stuff can be really helpful from a coach. So what works? Using fewer exercises, but doing more sets of those exercises and gradually ramping them up, like we've said. Starting with sub-maximal efforts and then gradually increasing. So you might start at set 1 at a 6 out of 10 effort, and then by the last set you're an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10 effort, but you've gone 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5, something like that. So you're spreading that increase. So most of your sets are not super hard sets, because you can still build strength in that 7 out of 10 effort zone where you're leaving 3-4 reps in the tank. And another thing, I don't think I've mentioned it here, but using higher reps. So for the type 3s, we either use higher reps, so we would go up to like 8 or 10 reps or 12 reps even sometimes for exercises, or we keep the reps lower, so it's like 5 reps, but then we start with the lower intensity and then gradually ramp up. So there's 2 different methods that you can use, is do a couple of 2, 3, 4 warm-up sets, whatever you feel to get ready, and then doing more reps in that one set, or do fewer reps, which can work, but as long as you ramp up the intensity gradually. And then, doing things gradually, like celebrating the little wins, really important, and then making sure that you have a plan. So how do I progress without the chaos? Progressing through, like we've said before, working on technique, improving the technique, not necessarily making the weight harder. And then when you feel good about the technique, then increase the weight. Smaller rep increases, so adding an extra rep each week or adding an extra rep every couple of weeks, and almost planning when you're going to have your rep increase so that you're never pushing super close to failure on any reps. Slower tempos, pauses, isometrics, all those things where we're slowing things down allows you to feel more in control of the lifts. So yeah, I think for the type 3s, the biggest takeaway is to focus on having a plan, focus on being in control while you're doing the lifts, and make sure that your plan is predictable and that it's not causing any anxiety. Okay, don't switch things up too much for the type 3s. Okay, you can once in a while, but again, even if you're switching something up, maybe switch one small part of the workout up. Okay, and that's the type 3s. Is there anything else I need to say here? I think that's it. I think you have the main point of that, the main understanding. So I hope this makes sense. That's type 3s.